time of the world picture. And secondly, the second essay we would read by Heidegger is the famous The Question Concerning Technology, in which the terms of enframing, and I will add to that ensnared, and being ensnared, ensnaring is also operative, reserve stock, framing, the framework, all of these things we take for granted, and we use this vocabulary, we're framing something, etc. Cinematic language, sociological language from Irving Goffman, of course, a book of his not really looked at much, but a lot of this is coming out of Heidegger, and both Heidegger in an ambiguous relationship with this kind of terminology as we go forward. So we'll try to begin with that. The reason I want to begin with Heidegger is I still think he's the most profound background thinker on, what is technology, where are we, in terms of more of a metaphysical reflection, a more philosophical problematic is being established by him. So I'd like to begin there and spend at least the first 3, maybe as much as 4 weeks on Heidegger and his work. I will suggest alongside this, if you're interested in questions, and again, Marx is always looming in the background. So of course, I want to mention a Greek philosopher who we're not reading, but certainly I'm willing to discuss if you've read him, is a man named Kostas Axelos, Axelos, who did a seminar on Marx and Heidegger, which is very, very good, called Future Marx. These are his lectures given on an attempted synthetic ground for Marx and Heidegger, because a lot of Marxists and a lot of the people we know, and including many of colleagues, friends, comrades over the years, have, associated Heidegger only with the National Socialist movement, right, and say there's no longer worth reading, or we have to dismiss him as a thinker of that ilk, even though the influence on Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Bernard Stiegler, Louis Althusser in a different way, especially French and contemporary French theory, is enormous, including French psychoanalysis. So, I take these things sort of with a grain of salt. Of course, you can write a sociological monograph on Heidegger's associations and go through it. You can do what Adorno did, the jargon of authenticity as a prolemma to the language, which he thought was going around. But we'll speak to this as we go forward. Also, of course, the negative dialectic, which is a Hegelian or a Kantian Hegelian attempt to engage Heidegger's thinking, especially the Heidegger of being in time. So these are very complex moments. And what I'm going to try to do is engage the readings in such a way that we have the historical materialism of a Walter Benjamin, the future of hope, right, if you will, with the work of art in the age of technical reproduction, which is a very different approach to technology than Heidegger has. So we'll maybe see some of the Frankfurt School and the Heideggerian moment, and its divergences, and I have a little thing, a very general sketch, and really a pencil sketch on time and temporality and since the Enlightenment for tonight. And then, so we would read Benjamin after that, right? Yes, thank you, Patrick. Absolutely, and yeah, he was very close to Lukács. And for those of you interested in this, and I mean, it's worth mentioning again. Some people, including Lucien Goldman, sociology of knowledge thinker in Paris, taught for many years, and basically thought of Being in Time, 1927, as a response to Georgy Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, especially the chapter on reification and class consciousness. And Andrew Feinberg, for example, wrote his early work on Lukács. His early philosophical endeavors were on Lukács. I think he wrote that with Marcuse, if I'm not mistaken, but with Herbert Marcuse. No, he didn't write it with Marcuse, no. Later, or tell me, Patrick, I'm sorry, yeah.
His dissertation under Marcuse.
Yes.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
his dissertation under Marcuse.
But yeah, that's what I said. The Lukács
Yeah,
was
yeah,
right,
yeah.
what was written under Marcuse. Yeah,
Yeah.
San Diego. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So there are a lot of cross currents here, and I don't want us to throw everything into the cooking pot, if you will, or to the the kitchen sink all at once, because there are grounds of major departure going on. So I thought Benjamin would be interesting, and what I have termed as a kind of optimism of technology, a careful optimism, if you will, about technology, whereas Heidegger, in a different way, had more of a pessimistic view, and at the same time, he thought in the extreme pessimism, like Heidegger thought, on the line of danger, that technology would ultimately reveal its real liberating potentiality. And that's a question we could bring up with, of course, Stiegler, because I think Stiegler takes that up of the Heideggerian moment. So the third group of readings would come from Stiegler, and I've been rereading, and Stiegler advised this. I made the mistake of taking Stiegler's advice. I hope it isn't too bad for you. I'm not sure this is the best way to be introduced to Stiegler, but the third volume of Technics and Time, on cinematic time, on cinematic consciousness, and if we have time, the American politics of adoption, right, is all very, I think, crucial to our moment, even though he writes this in, I think, 1994 in France. It was published, the third volume, 2001, I'm sorry. This was the third volume. And this was dedicated, this book, to Derrida, right? So Technics and Time, Cinematic Time, and the Question of Malaise is his third volume. And I'll talk about the first two as well as we go forward. I know for this group, we read a little bit of volume 1, the introduction, when we did Stiegler before. And we actually read some of the lost spirit of capitalism, or I like to call it capitalism has lost its mind instead, but we read this last year, or about a year and a half ago, or summer of 2020. And very interesting. And in fact, those of you, I maybe want to go back to it about the automation of the superego. So we'll have a psychoanalytic component, the argument that goes on with Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. And this will be another part of the Stiegler part vis-a-vis technology and automated work, automation that is going on. And in this case, both because I think it was an enormous contribution, and also in honor of his life work, Stanley Aronowitz's book, co-authored with Bill DeFazio, The Jobless Future, right? It might be a good suggestion. And I was talking with Josh, and Josh brought this up and saw the connection on automated work. So we can also go there, maybe as an addition, and I can get part of that for us too. A very substantial book, one that Stiegler did not read and did not participate in, and I think he would have been much more profound in his thinking if he had read The Jobless Future on technoscience. Basically a reflection on technoscience and technology and what it's doing to jobs. It's actually a long reading, if you will, of pages 690 to 720 of the Grundrisse on the machine, right? On the machine and work. Yeah, the fragment on machines, the famous work in Marx's Grundrisse. So, and then after that, I thought we would go to, and I don't know how many, he's not well known in the States, even though there is some following, Friedrich Kittler, who was at the Free University, very much influenced by Heidegger in a different way than Stiegler, and Optical Media would be the book we would look at, more of an empirical kind of thing. If you're interested in Kittler, one of his great books, worth studying. It's a long thing, long text, theoretical work called Discourse Networks. We just don't have enough time in the day, unfortunately, but Optical Media, we'll probably have some time, especially the chapters on technologies of the fine arts in particular. for those of you interested in the fine arts, etc. So this is a very important thinker and optical media, the last chapter. He also wrote a book called Film. He is being read, David. You want to tell me a little more about that? I'm not on top of what's read in media studies, unfortunately. But yeah, tell me about Kittler and.
Yeah, I mean, so for folks who know a little bit about some of the names around media studies, Jack Bradich is at
Jack
Rutgers, and the first class I took with Jack, we read, yeah, I guess it was discourse networks. Also, some of the newer folks like Packer and Reeves, who did some writing on police media, have drawn from like Foucault, but also specifically Kittler, because they want to look at media not as representational. And so the way that Kittler looks at media as like, in police media work, they're looking at logistics and communications rather than representational stuff. And so they want to draw off of Kittler rather than like the representational kind of branch in media studies. So that's why Jack's interested in him, and that's why Packer and Reeves also have a connection, like Jack does, to like the Midwest cultural studies kind of moment, like the Illinois Champaign-Urbana,
right.
And that whole. So that group, who are also kind of interested in Deleuze and autonomism, are for sure passing Kittler around and citing him in an article.
Great. Okay, good. Okay, so we have some background to work with there, and some other secondary studies then. Okay, and then I thought after Kittler, we'd have 4 major authors. We'd read, kind of as a semi-joke, but a serious joke, Chris Anderson's piece in Wired on, artificial intelligence and, what now will be metaverse, the kind of precursors to metaverse, that Facebook is now metaverse. So we'll look maybe at that as a kind of a manifesto of the Silicon Valley manifesto and other things around that. So that could be interesting empirically. So and again, I'm certainly open to suggestions. I'm trying to think this through, if you will, in terms of both divisions and ways of taking up stuff. But again, I want to emphasize that the Heideggerian background is still extremely profound. He's the one that basically opened up this space for thinking. I mentioned one other book, very influential on Walter Benjamin. You may have read it or know about it, Henri Fusselon. It's a Zone book called The Life of Forms, very, very history of forms. And Benjamin was very taken by this aesthetic, a very different kind of aesthetic, than Heidegger. Yeah, and most of you may know, and I don't want to, cloud the reading, but Benjamin and Brecht used to make fun of Heidegger's German language and his, stretching it and moving it, and this kind of attempt to bring it back to the ancient Greeks. But this is very important to remember about Heidegger. Heidegger is not interested in a dialogue with contemporaries. He's interested in an interior dialogue with Aristotle, Plato, the pre-Socratics, and then, of course, as you know, some of the courses he gave, German Romanticism, as the people that came out of comparative literature know, Hölderlin, right? A long course on Hölderlin, and then 4 years of a meditation on Nietzsche, right? As well. So this is not someone that, and basically told the students, if you want to read Nietzsche, read Aristotle for 10 years before you attempt to. So we're not dealing with, as Stanley Aronowitz used to say, small potatoes here. We're dealing with probably in some ways I've studied him for a long time, that, probably the most important, most violent, usurpation of the rewriting of Western ontology. Really, this was his project, to redo fundamental ontology. Very, very important to keep this in mind, that this is really his project at this point. Yeah, in a way. Yeah, and also some very interesting encounter with Marx, and I can go back to this as well. And I really open up the, again, the conversation between, those of us somewhat, immersed and a lot of us here, fundamentally immersed in Marx, and I hope a very creative Marx instead of a dogmatic, orthodox reductionist Marxism that we seem to see around us all the time. But again, Heidegger had his encounter with Marx in the letter on humanism, in terms of reading the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So we certainly can talk about that as well, in terms of, where we are. So anyway, on the books themselves, again, I don't know if it's available. I mean, Matt and Josh and, a few other people here are very good at finding the editions. The William Levitt translation is the one I'll be using. The question concerning technology and other essays. Matt posted them. Good, great, thank you, Matt. The first one would be the Age of the World picture. I'd like to do that. I'll maybe introduce it tonight. We'll talk a little bit about what he may be up to, and we can maybe work through dates too, maybe like a Dos Passos newsreel or a documentary in a sense. The Heidegger writes the age of the time of the world picture in 1938, which in my opinion is the beginning of the United States warfare state, same year, same period, right? And, Heidegger's classes were always intended by, National Socialist representatives that, so a lot of the stuff is coded, especially the Nietzsche lectures. That I know, from people that I've talked to that were very close to this and understand the German very well. So, so anyway, yeah, the 1938 essay, and then we will go on to the essay on the question concerning technology, which was 1955, right? And November of 55. And these were invitations by two conferences that Heidegger gave talks. If you're interested, I mean, there's a lot out there on being in time. I gave, about 21 lectures that are on YouTube on being in time from the great 1927 systematic treatise that he did in order to guarantee, you can imagine today if the requirement for tenure was to write being in time. So how many people would be tenured? But anyway, we can, you could go to look at that, and I can certainly riff off of what he's doing. But again, this is someone that is studying Aristotle and the book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics and book 4 of the Physics. These are his two lifelong, thrusts, if you will, or his real impetus for delving back into Greek philosophy. So I want us to keep this in mind. I mean, not only to read him as our contemporary, but also the stakes there are to try to make the German language of his time into, quote, a dialogue with the Greek of the philosophers, and this was about orientation. And I want to mention too, the notion of orientation is very, very important, because Stiegler's second volume, Technics and Time, and again, I don't know how much time you have for all this, but the second chapter of Disorientation on the industrialization of memory is one of his most crucial essays, on memory, the archive, etc. This is a very, very, very important essay of his, which I did not think could be part of this class, but please feel free to, and I can certainly mention it as we go forward. So this notion of orientation, disorientation will go throughout. So Heideggerian orientation is not so much into the cybernetic now, if you will, but it is more about, kind of a future's past, right? In a way, the long communication, if you will, with the dialogue with the ancient Greek. He thinks that Western metaphysics made a wrong turn from Plato to Nietzsche, right? And this is his attempt to correct right? This is what got us into this massive, uprootedness of the 20th century. I'm sorry, Gretchen, and I see our good friend Kristen is here. Gretchen, could you introduce yourself? I'm sorry, I'm Michael Peilas, and I'm kind of just riffing on the introduction to where we're going this semester. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, I apologize for joining late. I had a class until 10 minutes ago, but next week the time will change and it'll be all synced up.
Okay, cool. Where are you from?
I'm in Prescott, Arizona. I teach at a little college called Prescott College in the PhD program in sustainability education.
Okay.
My own training is in science and technology studies. And so this is an area that I have grazed but wanted to go deeper into. So I'm grateful to have space to do it with this group.
Great. Okay. Yeah, it's a very good group. I'm the lesser of all. So yeah, we have really some good people here. Great. Okay. And Kristen Lawler, our good friend and comrade from Brooklyn, is here, right?
Hi, sorry I'm coming late, but I just wanted to be able to get as much of this as I was able to today. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Okay, good. Good to have you, Kristen. And Kristen is the book editor of the Situations Collective. So if you want any books reviewed, send it to her and we'll probably review it. So yeah, anyway. Okay, great. So again, I want to just point this out about Heidegger. When you read him, it's not, just oriented towards, quote, the contemporary audience. He is in dialogue, not only attempting to present to us, right? But there is this dialogue and this kind of struggle with the ancient Greek happening as well in his German language. So I just want us to be aware of, the presentation in this level. And again, I want to emphasize that we have to take it slow. This is a slow thinker. I mean, even though the productivity is enormous, now we have all of his lectures. He only intended one book for publication. That was Sein und Zeit, 1927. The rest were handwritten lectures for his classes. So his corpus, which is, I think, close to 60, 70 volumes now, is basically lectures that were given to students, right? And coursework that he did. So it's a pretty amazing body of work. And to me, the clarity of thinking and the ability to really present in an incredibly profound and deep way is still very remarkable for us. So we can learn. I think he teaches us how to hear again. Whether we agree or disagree or can't stand the politics is another thing. But in terms of actual reading, yes, there's really one of the great, readers of texts in the history of philosophy, and to think of him that way. Derrida, who was not, quote, a rightist or even the part of the so-called conservative revolution, said that we have not even yet begun to exhaust the resources of critical hermeneutics. Michel Foucault's work, Order in Things, Archaeology of Knowledge, is completely dependent on Heideggerian fundamental ontology and what he did. So again, the background and the presence is pretty amazing. So after this sales job on why we should read Heidegger, I think we, I might want to hear from you. How many of you have, some kind of exposure to Heidegger, and what would that mean? What is that at this point? And where would we, I'm just getting a sense of how much we can do as well, if you don't mind. Yeah. So anybody, I mean, I know Josh has read some Heidegger. I know Richard certainly has. David probably has over the years. Sean, you were in the
I used in the class on being in time.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd like to hear from some people, any exposure and what of it was it, in a way, to Heidegger, or was it secondhand through, a synopsis or just an essay here or there? Because I'm going to try to be as comprehensive as possible. This is part of my shtick, if you will. Yeah. So maybe I could ask anybody relationship.
I'll jump in. I mean, I've read Being in Time and also the essay on technology, and the book on Kant. But that's it. But it's nothing systematic, in terms of careful.
Yeah,
but-
let me just mention, and I'll go to this in a minute too. The book on Kant is very important because we use this word problematic a lot. It's problematic, or the problematic is. This is where it's first articulated, by the way we use it. You know, we either unconsciously are using it, or we didn't know it comes out of this moment of the limited. Kant and the problem of metaphysics, another lecture he gave on Kant. Also, the great other study of Kant was what is a thing, right? What is a thing? Yeah. So thank you, Patrick. Anybody else? I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of, I don't want to, be too much at once, but kind of lead us into this in a good way. Yeah. Yeah.
Michael, you and I read The Question Concerning Technology together, and that was really informative. And but I know Heidegger mainly through Stiegler and through Stiegler's encounter with him.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
and also I know Adorno's critique.
Of Heidegger?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and which ones? The jargon and the negative dialectics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jargon, authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The jargon of authenticity, by the way, was a prolemogama to the greater studies. It was a kind of introduction to the negative dialectics. That's what Adorno intended there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Anybody else? I mean, you don't have to, speak of it. It's I'm just kind of interested in this. I know he has an ecological presence for some people. Heidegger's thing certainly filtered into comparative literature. Never really made it to film studies, although I never understood why not. Because I know some people that really read this stuff that really can work with Heidegger in a very productive way, especially the question of temporality. And this
he's in film studies. He's cited. He's generally cited. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
I could speak. I briefly, I got into Heidegger mainly through Derrida, and I remember the first text that got me involved was Of Spirit, his critique of animality, and Welt, with the lacking of world. And then I kind of got, and my interest in Heidegger has kind of waxed and waned over the years. It was very intense in graduate school. And then I kind of moved away after I graduated. And then in recent years, I've been much more interested in the Nietzsche lectures. I find those to be incredibly fascinating in a way. So yeah, I think it's kind of like I see him as a kind of constant presence, but I've kind of drifted away from Heidegger and towards other philosophers. So I'm interested to see how Heidegger's work will kind of go into different directions than I've pursued in the past.
Okay, no, that's good. That's interesting. For people that don't know, Derrida wrote a book to kind of salvage Heidegger from all the controversy in the 80s called Of the Spirit. And he looked at Geist in a very active way. And, Frederick Jameson has taken up Geist as meaning community in his recent work, which is kind of interesting, where he takes up Geist not as meaning just spirit or mind, as it was translated for many years vis-a-vis Hegel by the generation of Bailey before Miller did the Phenomenology of Spirit, right? And anyway,
he's trying to redeem. In my understanding, I have his recent book on phenomenology. He's trying to kind of redeem Hegel as well, as far as I understand, in terms of how Hegel's been interpreted.
Yes, absolutely. So it was written at the time to intervene on Heidegger on the behalf of the Heideggerian machinery, if you will.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think that was part of his intention during that period. Anybody else? And then I'll go on. I mean, I want to just open this up. Again, I would like to frame it and think. Yeah, Richard, please. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Mainly, when I was first in France in the 80s, I used to go because I knew Greek, but I didn't know much French. And friends were inviting me to go hear Derrida. And so he was lecturing on Heidegger's reading of but it was, and then there was Lacan's reading of Antigone, but mainly on technology. I was interested in, actually, I had interviewed Paul Virilio about the space shuttle crash, and did a couple articles about technology. And I think it was technology where I really got interested in Heidegger and could kind of dig into it. Yeah.
Okay, right, yeah. I mean, he lectured on so many philosophers, so I can't fill in the blank there for,
Yeah.
Derrida's reading of Heidegger on someone, et cetera. But, Heidegger was always present in Derrida, Derrida in some ways is,
what was so
very
nice,
Heideggerian in his moment.
It was, there was such a slow, careful reading. I just found the reading experience so pleasurable. He read Greek, that in combination they were reading Greek with such a closeness to the text. It was very enjoyable to read that slowly, and the translations and such. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so anybody else? Any relation? I know Josh has read Heidegger for a while and takes him seriously. Carl, nice to see you. You're here. Good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you
Hello?
read Heidegger, or are you dismissing?
No. I have avoided reading Heidegger all of my life, quite successfully.
Yes.
So,
Good. Lucky man, you. Yeah, you're not tortured at night through all these machinations of the German will to power.
Well, there's always time to start. So.
Okay, good. Okay, well, nice to see you, and glad you're with us today. Yeah. So anyway, okay. Well, Richard mentioned Antigone. If you're interested in Antigone, both as a play and as a document for our times, both Heidegger and Lacan did remarkably great commentaries on Antigone. And I want to mention a friend that Chris isn't here. Chris, are you here? She's walking back in the room. A mutual friend of Chris and ours, John Roshman at Columbia, wrote a book on Antigone as the founding document of psychoanalysis, right? Not the Oedipus myth, but the Antigone story, in a way. So very interesting there. Heidegger does a beautiful analysis of the chorus of man is so strange. And again, this is something we can keep in mind about technology, the estrangement of man and the domination over the earth and where that comes from. What is this metaphysical projection that has done this? In a way. And then secondly, of course, Lacan, the Antigone comes up because of the Algerian war, in the Algerian FLN, of which his stepdaughter participated in, and he dedicated, I think, the ethics of psychoanalysis to her that year. No? Or
yes, he brought it to her. She was in prison. The prison on Rue de la Roquette, the women's prison in Paris, and he brought her his seminar for her activities in opposition to the Algerian War, and he brought to her in prison the section of the seminar on Antigone, making this connection. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. I didn't know she was in prison with Lacan, but yeah, good for him. He left the office to go to the prison, right? Like he went to Gestapo to get the papers for his wife too. Yeah, I remember this in the 30s. He did this too. So that's great. Okay. And I'll tell you a little joke. Some people have heard this, and this is interesting of the Lacan-Heidegger relationship. Heidegger visited Paris, and Lacan had a Jaguar that he liked to drive fast around Paris. So in the car were Jacques Lacan driving, Martin Heidegger sitting what we call down south shotgun, the passenger seat in the front, and Sylvie Lacan, Bataille's first wife, Lacan's wife after that, and Martin Heidegger's wife were in the back seat. So Heidegger's wife says, Elfriede, could you ask the good doctor to slow down? So Heidegger mumbles to Lacan, could you slow down? My wife is getting sick or something. So Lacan, in typical Lacan style, sped up, right? So the idea here is death drive overcomes being towards death. So, the Freudian moment overtakes the existential, moment in the death drive. So anyway, just a little aside. Okay, well, good. Okay, so, we can go back to this. The Antiquity reading, by the way, is the Introduction to Metaphysics of Heidegger, 1935 lecture. And I'll talk about the notion of planetary technology vis-a-vis that, right? We'll see planetary technology at work, but we will talk about planetary technology and conservative revolution and the responses to this. And I'm sure Josh and some of the other people here tonight will be able to bring us, Jocelyn and others, can bring us up to speed, if you will, on the Marinetti manifestos, the futurist manifestos, and how much this was playing out in technology too. And then Richard, who has, direct contact with Paul Virilio, Speed and Politics, one of our most profound thinkers today. And then, of course, going back to our friend from the Boeing days, this was also about reserve stock and the war machine at work too, as well. So we have a lot that's going on here. But let me just try to frame this. I want to just talk about temporality for a minute, I would like us. I'll start reading this tonight so we can get into it. It's a long piece, the Age of the World picture, I think, or the Time of the World picture. It also has a very interesting set of appendices. So I would like us to read that for next week in the text, and then we can go over it more and more. It's very dense. I think it speaks to us today in a very active way. But let me just try to do something really quickly here. The Western emphasis on temporality ever since the Enlightenment, and as most of you know, the time of the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung in Germany, really begins with the Kantian moment, the 1781 publication of the Critique of Pure Reason. And this is where Kant extended principles of David Hume that are permanent, irreversible, and universal, that he takes from the imagination and he transfers this to the entire structure of the human mind, right? The permanent notion of temporality, its irresistibility, and also its universality, so that he really became the person who tried to salvage in philosophy the timeless truth for philosophical thought. Kant was the last representative that really tried to capture, quote, the eternity or the timeless truth in philosophical thought. That philosophy was about verités, if you will. So from the movement from the atemporal to the temporal, which was part of the third critique, which in my opinion is the modern text of aesthetic theory, the third critique of Kant, the critique of judgment, in which he makes distinctions between judgment and taste and all of that. But I'm just really just giving an overview here in terms of temporality. And then there's a shift, right? Of course, with Hegel after the Enlightenment, where Hegel begins to talk about history as the development of freedom. And that plays out again in the 20th century with Sartre, the future as freedom. So the development of freedom, of course, this plays out in the master-slave dialectic or lordship and bondage section. And, Hegel is also talking about the reason of state. And of course, the real is the rational and the rational is the real. And this is all framed in terms of time and the time of development that ultimately is reconstituted in the ending of a circle or a closure of the circle of the drive for absolute truth, absolute knowledge, absolute knowing, where the main three spheres come together in this culmination in the historical world spirit, art, religion, and philosophy all merge in this dialectical, unfolding, etc. So time is futural in Hegel, and it really is about development. So progress is really associated somewhat with the Hegelian moment, the future as progress or temporality as progress. And then, of course, you have on the right side of this Soren Kierkegaard's concept of dread or anxiety. And the concept of anxiety is the future as dreadful, right? We're in a map. We're always anxious about the future. This was one reaction, of course, to the Hegelian system, and this whole notion of, the future itself makes us anxious, etc. And of course, as most of you know, Kierkegaard's way out of this was the so-called leap of faith and a return to the eternal nature of the leap of faith into the religious world, right? Outside of that, of the ethical world, or the other stage, the aesthetic world. So for aesthetic world, for Kierkegaard, was a temporality of possibility, right? But one was always faced with too many possibilities. And the moral world, if you will, or the ethical world, was that of the one singular choice. And the allegory to the story was the sacrifice of Isaac in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where Abraham is not an ethical man. He teleologically suspends the ethical in the name of the moral leap of faith. So for Kierkegaard, the future is this leap of faith, right? Which brings on enormous anxiety, right, etc. Abraham, in biblical term, in the Old Testament, is not an ethical person. He sacrifices his son for something unknown, for a leap of faith, etc. So I'm being very, very general here, but I'm trying to, again, show where we went in terms of Western continental philosophy. Then, of course, the future, boundless future, if you will, and I'll go back to Kant for a second. Those of you interested in temporality and Kant, Deleuze's little intervention, Kant's critical philosophy, where he begins with Hamlet's famous saying, "The time is out of joint," is a very good reading of Kant and critical philosophy, and this temporality that gets stuck, right? He has no way out of it. From the atemporal to the temporal, he just fails miserably in this moment. So the time is always out of joint for Deleuze, and really looking back at Kant. So of course, then Nietzsche, in terms of the boundless future, future that, in the primary text here, concept of anxiety for Kierkegaard. Of course, the phenomenology of spirit for Hegel. Forget the logic in this case. It's a kind of extension of Kant and trying to develop, outside of the blockage that Kant faced in the third critique. And then Nietzsche's, the boundless future, the genealogy of morals, again, a classic text. And, these are books that I guess one would want if one is completely into the development of the mind and not other pleasures. If you're on a desert island, you take the genealogy of morals with you. And it's a great, great read. It kind of, takes the scales off the eyes, still very relevant today with all this new Victorianism that is all over the universities, and it's kind of back to the pilgrims and, prudish nature of so much that we're encountering now. And, everybody's walking on eggshells, in other words. So Nietzsche is really howling for wherever he is. I can hear the cosmic laughter. So anyway, Marx, of course, the future for Marx were statements of the conjecture. As a conjunctural thinker, that somehow the inevitable aim of capturing power is And the immediate aim to capture power is through the proletariat, through the working class, etc. This is all part of the future of Marx. This gets much deeper when you read, of course, Axel Ost, but Marx, in terms of the early Marx economic and philosophical manuscripts, is thinking of future as a statement of conjuncture. This is where we are, location, if you will, in a sense, and of course, we'll talk about this later in terms of labor time and, what Heidegger has to say about this, and certainly Stiegler. And again, I want to mention this just as an aside, as another background in terms of myths. It seems like in the 20th century and going into the 21st, we're encountering three different myths from the Greek world. The Promethean myth, or stealing the knowledge from the gods, right? Of course, of which Marx is probably a part of, stealing all the secrets of the capitalists that they didn't even know themselves, right? In a sense, that there was a Promethean energy there of stealing the fire, and we go into the vernacular of, lighting the fire in the belly, the fire in the head, etc., and very Heraclitean in a sense, in a way. And then, of course, the myth of Sisyphus, that so many of us in political struggles, certainly myself in union struggles and other endeavors out there, long-term political struggles, that we're always pushing the rock up, right? We get close to maybe some kind of breakthrough, but then it falls down on us and we start again. But as Albert Camus once said in his writing, The Myth of Sisyphus, it's easy to imagine Sisyphus happy, our modern Stoic, if you will, that the struggle is endless. And that's a very Marxian position too. When he was asked by his, and Kristen knows this work well, The Right to be Lazy Son-in-Law, Paul Lafarge, he asked, Lafarge asked the old man, what is the meaning of life? And the old man replied, one word, struggle. So, in a way, this kind of endless struggle into the future, another thing that has to do with Sisyphus. So these two myths are always working. And then, of course, Prometheus's brother, of which Stiegler and Simondon, are coming from, the Epimethean, that we're not really in control, that the technics itself is determining who we are. And again, I recommend a masterpiece. Bruno Gulli's not joining us because he's pressed for time, but he may join us when he goes to Mexico and he has a little more time. But anyway, he's reading right now the great book by André Leroy-Gourhan called Gesture and Speech. It's an arm and a leg in terms of affordability in English, but yeah, Memory and Rhythm is a very, very important book for this course. And I want to also suggest the late work of Henri Lefebvre is also about time, another person, rhythm analysis. So this is also time and rhythm, and the rhythmos is very active in the early history of the Greek atomists. So this is a very vast subject, for those of you, thinking about ideas, there are so many in between that can be developed. So, we can, even though Heidegger doesn't engage Epicurus or Democritus, there's a lot of this present in the thinking of temporality. So anyway, we have this kind of boundless future. Nietzsche, we don't know the horizon yet, right? We were taking that risk. The philosophers of the future are the great tempters, right, in a sense, and he opens up that space. This is very interesting. When many people say he leads to nihilism, there's nothing further from the truth. If you read The Will to Power carefully, which are fragments put together by Walter Kaufmann, organized, but to me, this was Nietzsche's political statement. The Will to Power is an attempt to be much like Machiavelli for the 20th century. So, in a way, he's really trying to, give us something well beyond where we are, the beyond, if you will, in terms of temporality. It's always the beyond with Nietzsche. And not the beyond in the sense of a return to metaphysics, but beyond the language that we use in terms of future. And of course, grammatology, Nietzsche says we have not killed God because we have not killed grammar yet, right? Another very interesting proposition that in a way, the Derridian moment really understood this very deeply, telegrammatology. And when we get to Stiegler, we'll speak more about, the ages of grammatization versus the age of world picture and the age of, the technological moment, right? We'll be speaking about grammatization as a way of dealing with time in a different way. But I do recommend, I know we don't have endless time, so we're not in that sphere, but I do recommend Andre Leroy-Gourhan's book, Gesture and Speech, as a read. It's very, very clever. It's tremendously influential, as well as Simondon's book on what is it called, on technical individuation and technical things. We'll talk about processes of individuation on technical objects in Simondon, who was actually a student and a friend of Gilles Deleuze as well. And kind of unknown, again, except for a handful of people. These are not dominant thinkers in the academy right now. So it's kind of a specialized group such as yourselves who have any exposure to Gilbert Simondon. So anyway, those are the major figures, 19th century, in its relationship to temporality, of which are taken up. We still think under, and I'll mention the other two H's. In the 20th century, Edmund Husserl comes along and says philosophy has lost a sense of the concrete, and it wants to go back to, the things themselves. This is the battle cry of phenomenology, to go back to the things, and he emphasizes themselves, right, in a sense, right? Not only the things and the objects in the world, or the das Ding, but the relationship themselves, right, in relations always. And he comes up with a whole philosophy called phenomenology, which is never an end. It's always a process, where one is engaging the phenomena outside of our natural habituated attitude towards the things in the world. So there's an uprooting of our perception. There's an undoing of our normalized perception into seeing things very differently. And of course, Husserl was very active in film studies, especially in the 1960s and 70s, right? The phenomenology, for film and phenomenology, many works along that line, film as phenomena, etc. So Husserl became and of course the ego as the site of synthesis, right? So this ecological realm is created, again, temporally, in terms of now time, now points, and what he calls, and we'll see this language later in Stiegler, retention and protension, right? Protention and retention in terms of imaging and in terms of sounds, right? And what he calls, in the book that Derrida studied, I think the two books were very influential on the early Derrida. If you like this stuff, I like the background, obviously. So the backstories here were the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. He studied that book, I think, until his end, of Edmund Husserl, and of internal time consciousness, as well as, of course, the study of Tran Bach To, the Vietnamese philosopher, phenomenology and dialectical materialism, which is an attempt to bring Marx into the equation with phenomenology. And Tran Bach To was a leading Vietnamese philosopher who was really one of the another forgotten person, in a way, and in the history of philosophy. So anyway, Husserl was very influential. Speaking of which, Franz Brentano's On the Manifold Senses of the Word Being in Aristotle were lectures he gave and a book he published that influenced both Freud and Husserl. Both were present at these lectures of Brentano. And the joke, of course, was Husserl took it to the heavens, Freud took it to the basement or to the underground, right? What they learned about the several senses of the meaning of being. So, and this was a book that Heidegger studied very actively, and the notion of the manifold. not only just the unfolding, but the manifold of the unfolding, very active kind of thing. So so Husserl is very, very important. Of course, Heidegger was a student of Husserl. The logical investigations were studied very actively, published the same year as the interpretation of dreams and the death of Nietzsche, and also Louis Bachelar's theory of speculation. 1900 could be a different Bertolucci film with those 4 books, right? Speculative capital, thinking about capital, right? As well as the dream work and the dream itself, and the discoveries that Freud made in his book. Logical investigation, especially the 6th book, which is a chapter which is a study of expression and meaning, of which Derrida writes about in The Voice and Phenomena. And then, there's this trajectory back to the 1900 death of Friedrich Nietzsche. Who was into his 11th year of madness at that time, being taken care of his mother and writing poems to the sun, the heliosphere, as his girlfriend. So this was Nietzsche in his madness. So anyway, so then Heidegger comes along, in terms of a very different approach to time. It's no longer internal time consciousness or consciousness and time, but the future itself becomes the finite future for Heidegger. Finitude, human finitude, the aspect and the crucial passages in Being and Time on being towards death, right? And Dasein, and the design analytic that comes out has to be circumscribed in a finitude, etc. And from that, we get people that such as Hannah Arendt, who have this moment of natality and mortality. This is always the play of the active life, and she frames this very much in Heideggerian times of the future. Simultaneously, when Heidegger and his relationship to the Enlightenment, which is much more through Kant, and the problem of metaphysics, he's more interested in that. The Frankfurt School is basically about the twilight of enlightenment and the dialectic of enlightenment. And we're going to, look at Benjamin in that kind of light of the Enlightenment, right? Is that there's a twilight on the Enlightenment in many ways, and the dialectical tensions involved in this. Heidegger is not really, in his way, a thinker of the Enlightenment. The passage, the detour, if you will, is back to the ancient Greeks and this kind of long conversation, but through a reading of contemporary philosophical texts and philosophical ideas. Whereas for Adorno and certainly Horkheimer in the dialectic of enlightenment, it's about the twilight of the Enlightenment, and they take it much more into a different direction, certainly much more materialist in terms of culture, industry, analysis, and other things of this nature. And then we also have the French early moments, Sartre, the future and freedom, contingency, and that everyone is free at the bottom, this kind of spontaneous notion of after you get through all the essences, that what's left is the freedom that we possess. So Sartre became, the thinker of freedom in the world. Foucault, freedom is a rupture. That the freedom is really a rupture from the past. He'll go through this, of course, in the Order and Things in terms of discursive regularities, and in his great methodological text that is not studied so much, The Archaeology of Knowledge, which is a Kantian, Husserlian work, and at the same tremendously influenced by Heidegger, this rupture, this moment of rupture in a sense. And then Derrida, in some ways, the later Derrida more than the earlier one, the future is hope, right? Which goes back to Benjamin's notion of history as a messianic thing, right? Such as a messianic, okay? So anyway, so this is a kind of very broad outline, these relations to temporality. Please feel free to intervene or say what you have to say on any of these. I mean, this is really very small pencil sketch, right? A relationship of temporality from the Kantian impasse, right, early on, which leads to, the back to the atemporal. He tries to get to the temporal, right? And he fails miserably in the critique of judgment, to, the future that's opened up by Hegel as the future of the development of, the self-understanding. If you've read the Phenomenology and gone through it, you see it as a progression. You see it as a development, the development of the world historical spirit alongside the development of self-understanding and self-consciousness especially, right? And then, of course, Marx is a reaction to that in terms of making the Hegelian categories materialistic, and in a way, the birth of a kind of new political economy in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and with the immediate aim of this new class, the proletariat, that will take, power, etc. This is the immediate aim. And then in the 19th century, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, in different ways, speak about the future, one as dreadful and anxious, the other as a boundless future, a horizon we have not yet gotten to, which is part of the seduction. The philosopher, again, is seduced to the great tempters, the philosophers of the future. He speaks of this often, Nietzsche, throughout his work. I suggest, if you're interested in this, Beyond Good and Evil, and of course, The Genealogy of Morals, or two texts he does that. The Will to Power is a very political text, in a sense, and one that's worthy of looking at today in terms of, where we are, both in the conservative tradition and what the left might be able to learn from it. And then, of course, with Husserl, Heidegger, the two other H's, and has been said, the masters of suspicion in all of this about consciousness, of course, with Hegel, the master of suspicion was Marx, right? The overturning of the categories, putting Hegel back on his feet, right, instead of standing on his head, of course. And with Husserl, the consciousness, Freud, with the discovery after, it had been discovered before him, but he's the one who really problematizes the unconscious, that we don't know what we're doing. The ego itself and this egological realm is an impossibility, right, for Freud, because there's no mastery in the house, so to speak, right? And this, looking at this as another moment. And then, of course, with Heidegger, the relationship of Nietzsche to Heidegger, the future not so much as finite, but as boundless, right? In a sense, we don't know, right, in a sense. So Nietzsche doesn't have the same kind of, I could say this openly, a nostalgia for the Greeks like Heidegger does, even though he writes many of his early texts, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he's very bound by this. But at the end, he's thinking through in a very different way. But we can also try to situate this temporality through the politics of time too, and this would be an interesting way of approaching it. So I'll stop here for a second, just in terms of that, and then maybe I'll introduce a little bit of the age of the spirit, again, the time of the world picture is probably a better translation, and some of the key points, and then next week we can take that up. Yeah. So anybody, any thoughts or any commentary or riffs on what I'm trying to do here? Yeah. Just trying to situate it a little bit, again, with a very small pencil sketch, if you will. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Mike, I just wanted to mention when you were talking about Heidegger's relationship to Husserl, and in the beginning part of this text that we're going to read next week, he makes this distinction between the Greek conception of science and the modern conception.
Yes.
And
actually, the time of the world picture, right?
Yeah. And that relationship actually is drawn out a little bit more in this in his lectures on Husserl and What is the Thing, actually.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's in section B, but the section on, it starts with the section on mathematics, I think on page like 70 something.
Okay. Okay.
But it'd be good to sort of maybe read that in parallel too, because like you're saying, that kind of relationship to time kind of he kind of shows that pretty clearly between this kind of this classical Greek conception of time and the sort of modern one,
Yes.
right in that section too.
Yes.
So
The word on Husserl at one level was always that it was a retrieval in some ways of the Platonic theory of forms, that phenomenology led ultimately through this eidetic reduction, the suspension of the natural standpoint, natural attitude towards the world of things, led back to a kind of level of abstraction very similar to what Plato does in the theory of forms, right? So this was always a word, and also led to ultimately a kind of, if you will, a finite subjectivity in a sense. So we're still in the metaphysics, if you will, of subjectivity, of which Heidegger is really trying to get out of, ultimately. Even though Dasein in the early stages can have some moments of subjectivity and still smacks of that, he's trying to get out of that. But I'm really glad you bring this up, Josh, too, because Husserl and Heidegger are both Greeks in their way, if we can use that loosely as a metaphor. Again, there's a confrontation here between the Platonic eidos, the eidetic and the form, getting to the forms, versus that of a kind of attempt to look at the thing itself in a very different way through a hermeneutical circle, and through, again, an attempt to look at philosophy not as science. Husserl thought philosophy could be a rigorous science again, and Heidegger somehow was very skeptical of this. And he made a statement, and this is something you can hold throughout this course and we can reflect on: science does not think, right? Science does not think is what Heidegger said about science ultimately, right? And we have not interrogated the being of science. So again, this ontological inquiry is really operative through Heidegger till the very end, right? Yeah, and so the ontological is always there. Richard, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I just I've been very interested in writes in French. He's originally Iranian, who did a book of interviews with Godard. He wrote a 3-volume history of Orson Welles, the work of Orson Welles, a guy named Youssef Ishaq Bur. And he did a little interview book with Godard about his long opus, Histoire. And, and one of the things that Godard says there, which I thought was very interesting, he said he thinks of film these days as not a shelter from time, but a shelter of time, a place where you can preserve time.
Wow.
That at the present moment, the present is made so pressing and so annihilating of any sense of time, of temporality, such as it came about, such as we see it in the films he quotes from in the course of Histoire. And I found that a very interesting notion. And then when I did the film on Lacan, one of the things that was interesting there were the short sessions, because the short sessions, Lacan, who would end sessions, he would make a cut in a sense. It's very cinematic. And when you just go to a 50-minute hour, it's kind of, it's very hard to correlate it with cinema. And yet when you do this, and of course, but when you do these short sessions of different lengths, it's much more conducive to cinema in a certain way. And of course, cinema and Freud, have both born in the 19th century, and this sense of where we are now in terms of this, where you get film becomes, just part of the way you sell commodities, that there's just this relationship between the moving image, the commodity form, and a kind of creation of a kind of certain kind of subjectivity of the consumer. So it was, you know, I think it's a question that is, I don't know, really interests me.
I'd love to go back to this when I mean, you know, and throughout the course, of course, but the idea of cinematic image and time in Stiegler, right?
Great.
And I love this phrase of Godard, not as a shelter, but a preserver of time. It's a very beautiful thing. Film is no longer an escape, but it preserves something.
Exactly.
Moment. Yeah. So that's very, very nice. Josh, you wanted to say something? I see you're unmuted. No? Okay. Yeah. Anybody else on this? And of course, we begin with the age of the time of the world image here, right? The world picture, you know, in a sense, you know, and of course, picture may be even a bad translation of build. You know, images build, and Bildung, as many of you know, is basically, you know, the formation of character, right? A character, the Bildungsroman, you know, for example, right, has something to do with culture as well, right? So there are many levels to this in terms of just thinking through the title. You know, who are the antagonists here? Is it Wilhelm Dilthey and his methodology? Does Heidegger have this in mind? You know, these layers of meaning that you can bring to this. Of course, the world of image thinking, right? Picture thinking. You know, is this what, you know, technology has brought about? 1938, of course, Leni Riefenstahl, you know, as you know, is the National Socialist filmmaker, and she's not, again, a hack, right? Knows exactly what she's doing. So that's another thing that we could really take into account, what's going on in 38. And of course, we can go back to look at Weimar and maybe how this is programming this through Lang, von Sternberg, and some of the masters of German, you know, expressionist cinema. So yeah, very, very good. Yeah. So I want to keep that in mind. Yeah, and this whole notion of the cinematic time, right, going forward, and yeah. So you know, the problem is today. I mean, I find this a lot with you know, the teaching that you know, we have a problem with a generation that is so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter oriented, and, you know, just encapsulated in this world of opinions, that going to the movies is not anymore the, you know, the thing it used to be. Me, I love, like Wittgenstein, just to go to a movie by myself, right, and sit, right, and see it. Dennis Rowe, who was here earlier, used to go to 4 to 5 movies a day in LA. He is a binger. He's not here, I'll tell you know, but he'll be back about his book, The Birth of the Binge. But anyway, we've lost this kind of practice in some ways, where, you know, this streaming, and he can talk about this in terms of his own work today, how this is also, you know, influencing the way we see in perception materially. Right, not only just ideally, etc., but really materially in the world. So yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. I like this distinction, Godard, typical Godard, who really is probably the most reflective of filmmakers, or certainly one of the most reflective of filmmakers, between sheltering versus preserving. I really like that a lot. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah. I'm always thinking with the James Bond movie. I mean, I live in cinema pretty much most of the time, but in Weekend, because now the James Bond movie is the big thing, when God appears to them, you know, the son of Alexander Dumas and God. Remember the guy with the camera, and he's going to give him 3 miracles. So the actress, I think it's Muriel Dark, says, "I would like a weekend with James Bond." You stupid bourgeois! You're not worth a miracle. I always think of this when the latest James Bond comes out. The Godard was right on target with this back in the day. So this was, you know, 67, right? 67, I think, was Weekend, right? It was 68. Yeah. So anyway, okay, good. All right. let me do this. We usually go over time to those of you. I mean, I guess I'm a diehard in some ways, and like to go on with a lot of the thinking or whatever's on the table. But I know it's advertised as 10 sessions. We're probably not going to cover it all in 10. So if you're really interested, we'll probably go at least 12, right? Sessions, etc. on this, and try to get as much as we can in. And please feel free with questions. I mean, I'm just trying to introduce it tonight in a sense. Again, this text, and I guess you don't have it yet, but I'll kind of read it, give you an idea of how Heidegger works, because maybe some of you haven't been exposed or really been down with him at all, in terms of this kind of, if you will, it's a very unfolding Germanic style, right? It's repetitious, but at the same time, it is always unfolding something different. It's a very, very interesting, way he works. So he begins in metaphysics, and this was a June 9th, 1938 lecture that was given in Freiburg. Yeah. And it was, for basically a conference, I think, on the metaphysics of the modern, of the modern world picture, right? The establishing by metaphysics of the modern world picture. So he begins, and there are some crucial things we have to be aware of here. Again, what he's doing in some ways. He's really trying to educate us philosophically. He's trying to get us into the philosophical language. In metaphysics, reflection, and reflection, Besinnung, is a metaphysical reflection, right? Which is accomplished through the essence of what something is, and then how you make a decision. So reflection means something other than just reflecting on something. It's a much more active process. This sin, right? Sin is a sense of something. The be brings it together in a direction, etc. And this is how the essence of what is something, right? How a decision is made in that essence, right? Takes place regarding the essence of truth, right? Metaphysics grounds an age. So this notion of ground for Heidegger is very, very important, or grounds of time. So that through a specific interpretation of what is, and through a specific comprehension of truth, it gives to that time the basis upon which it is essentially formed. This basis holds complete dominion over all the phenomena that distinguish the age. Let me stop here just for a second. Heidegger wrote a history of being. Like we write histories, Heidegger wrote a history of being. And there are three components to this history of being. One, the first history, the first moment of a philosophical age was the Greek age, in which the thinking of toon, the one, and toun is being discussed. The one and the many is the Greek thinking of the time. Everything revolves around that. That marks that epoch, right? To think through the one, right? Alongside the many. So when you read a book about multiplicity or the multitude of Deleuze, or you see this working in Spinoza, for Heidegger, this is not the Greek way of thinking, it's something else that comes up much later, right? The one and the many are being talked about constantly throughout Greek philosophy, and this is what marks its era. Then it shifts to nature, to natura. That's the second history of being, right? And he thinks of this as metaphysical moments that are very forceful. These come as forces. These are not things that, are built up to or whatever. These are forces that mark the age, and one reads within that. And the third one, of course, is our epoch, before the age of technology, self-consciousness. This begins with, for some people, Lutheran. Martin Luther is the first thinker of subjectivity. For Heidegger and others, probably Descartes, right? The thinker of subjectivity, right? In many ways. The cogito, the age of the cogito, and then of course self-consciousness from the cogito to self-consciousness in Hegel, right? The I think that accompanies all representations, the I think, right, that is part of the ecological realm, etc. So anyway, he is looking at an epoch here. He is now calling this the time of the world picture, right? Or the world imaging, right, that goes on, or world picturing might even be better put in terms of the term. So it called dominion over the age. So this age of self-consciousness is now becoming, on the cusp, if you will, of this time of technology, right? And what it includes, this age of picture thinking, world picture, right? This is how we are, again, inframed and ensnared. Conversely, on the other hand, in order that there may be an adequate reflection upon these phenomena themselves, the metaphysical basis for them must be itself apprehended, right? We must understand, it must be apprehended metaphysically to them, or in them, excuse me. And reflection is the courage, and this is a nice definition of reflection to me. Reflection is the courage to make the truth, and this is in the first paragraph, of our own presuppositions, right? And the realm of our own goals into the things that most deserve to be called into question. And there's a footnote to Appendix 1, and of course, reading with Heidegger and thinking him through, sometimes it's good to follow the instruction to go back to the appendix. So we can see there are many propositions in the appendix. And, I'll go through this next week a little bit on the story of truth is not truth as we understand it, but it's aletheia, right? Unconcealment, right? Moving away from the alpha privative, from structural lethe, right? For forgetfulness, right? We have forgotten this question of being, which opens up being and time. So this is going to be very important for us to keep in mind. So one of the essential phenomena of the modern age is its science, where Josh wanted to go. A phenomena of no less importance is machine technology. So two of the things we have, right? Computerization and science, right? Etc. We must not, however, misinterpret the technology as the mere application of modern mathematical physical science to praxis. Machine technology is itself an autonomous transformation of praxis, a type of transformation, wherein praxis that demands the employment of mathematical physical science. Machine technology remains up to now the most visible outgrowth of the essence of modern technology, which is identical with the essence of modern physics. So we have an identity, a correspondence here between machine technology and, of course, the essence of modern metaphysical. A third equally essential phenomena of the modern period is the event, and this is for the people that are studying aesthetics or engaged there, moving into the purview of aesthetics. That means that the artwork becomes the object, and this is very important for those of you working on dissertations, maybe to think through. In this, for the younger folks with us, the object of mere subjective experience, and that consequently art is considered to be an expression of human life. I don't know, Josh, you want me to start there for a second, and then he goes on to culture. So he's taking on art, culture, machine technology, all in the first couple of paragraphs here. Yeah. Josh, you want to comment on the artwork today? I mean, this is something we can then speak to Benjamin later. Yeah.
No, sorry, I don't really have anything to say at the moment about that.
About the subjective experience of the artwork only, and
yeah, okay.
Object of mere subjective, and that consequently is considered to be only an expression of human life. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Yeah. He has a very interesting thing here, and this is a distinction I want to make too in the German between Erlebnis, right, and Erfahrung. These are crucial terms. Erlebnis literally means subjective experience. It's experience on the surface. It's life experience, and it's mostly concerns adventure and event, right? Adventure and event. It's a surface phenomena in a way, this Erlebnis, right? some people try to translate this as lived experience. Yes, but only on the surface. There's another level of experience that Heidegger will go to, which is Erfahrung, which is in which discovery and learning is taking place. It's transformative. It's an undergoing, right? Right. So the notion of superficial experience, is more, or Leibniz, whereas Erfahrung is a much more substantial, transformative experience. So this is, we're lacking. The Frankfurt School, Adorno and Heidegger are very close on this, by the way. The Frankfurt School always spoke about the Erfahrung in everyday life, that's what's missing. This is what Adorno is trying to do in the negative dialectics, penetrate all subjectivity or all notions of the subject to get back to this level of experience that we have certainly covered up, that we're not really experiencing things. And of course, some of us remember Jimi Hendrix, to put it in popular culture, are you really experienced, right? Anyway, but yeah, I won't go there, but yeah, anyway. But the Erfahrung or Leibniz is very important to kind of keep this distinction in mind, because we use this word very loosely. And experience, Richard can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's from the Greek word, the peri, except danger, right? It's also related to danger, right? That the Erfahrung, in some ways, is more the danger of experience, right? Than just the superficial, oh, it was my experience, that was bad or good, etc. Right? I don't know. I think it's related to danger, the word experience in Greek, right? It has that element in it. Yeah, yeah. The peri, yeah, experi, right? Anyway, okay. So he'll go on. The fourth phenomena is the fact that human activity is conceived and consummated in culture. Right? This culture is the realization of the highest values through the nurture and cultivation of the highest goods of man. It lies in the essence of culture as such nurturing, to nurture itself in its turn, and thus to become the politics of culture. So the fifth phenomena is the loss of the gods, right? And this is very important. The loss of the gods, and in a way, he's talking about, I like the translation that Lovett comes up with, de-godinization. Very important, de-godinization, footnote number 5, Entgotterung, right? The loss of the gods. This expression does not mean the mere doing away with the gods, gross atheism, right? I'm just an atheist, right? Etc. I don't believe that shit. The loss of the gods is a twofold process. And this is very interesting. On the one hand, the world picture is Christianized in so much, and this gives you a first indication of where he's trying to go here, Christianized in as much as the cause of the world is posited, right? First cause, as infinite, unconditioned, unconditional, and absolute. On the other hand, Christendom transforms Christian doctrine into a worldview, the Christian worldview, and in that way makes itself modern and up to date. The loss of the gods is the situation of indecision regarding God and the gods. Christendom has the greatest share in bringing it about. Yeah, but the loss of the gods is so far from excluding religiosity that rather only through that loss is the relation to the gods changed into mere religious experience. So again, back to this notion of experience. When this occurs, then the gods have fled, right? They have absconded. He likes to use the word, the gods have left us, have absconded, from us. They have left us. And the resultant void, this is interesting, is compensated for by means of historiographical and psychological investigation of myth. So he's very on top of the disciplines, and there are many people that we can speak to here in this psychological, certainly Carl Jung, right, in many ways, for Heidegger could be an antagonist here, right, in a way, this psychological interpretation, investigation of myth, and the historiographical investigation of myth. So what understanding of what is, what interpretation of truth lies at the foundation, right, of this phenomena? So then he says, we will put a limit, the question, to the phenomena mentioned first, to Wissenschaft, the German word for science. more powerful than our science, which comes from the Latin sciere, to know. This is more the process and activity of knowing that is injunctive. So what understanding of what is and of truth provides the basis for that essence? If we succeed in reaching the metaphysical ground that provides the foundation for science as a modern phenomena, then the entire essence of the modern age will have to let itself be apprehended from out of that ground. So again, he's trying to establish this metaphysical grounding, if you will, right? This metaphysical grounding. When we use the word science today, and this is interesting, typical Heidegger, the move to the etymological and the move back again to the Greeks, right? Yep. For Heidegger, Roman imperialism is an enemy. Just like imperialism, it's for Lenin, right? In a different way, in a very different way. So anyway, when we use the word science today, it means something essentially different from the doctrine and the scientia of the Middle Ages, and also from the Greek episteme, from which we get the word epistemology, of course, right? And episteme is always in opposition in relation to doxa, this relationship between opinion and knowledge in the Greek sense, right? And doctrine, the teaching, and scientia, knowledge in the Middle Ages. So think of these things, again, as both and relationally than just either or, right? That's happening. Greek science was never exact, number one, right? Precisely because in keeping with its essence, it could not be exact and did not need to be exact. Right? Hence, it makes no sense whatever to expose that modern science is more exact than that of antiquity. Neither can we say that the Galilean doctrine of freely falling bodies is true, and that Aristotle's teaching that light bodies arrive upward is false. For the Greek understanding of the essence of body and place and relation between the two rests upon a different interpretation of beings, and hence conditions a correspondingly different kind of seeing and questioning of natural events. No one would presume to maintain that Shakespeare's poetry is more advanced than that of Aeschylus, right? It is still more impossible to say that the modern understanding of whatever is more correct than that of the Greeks. Therefore, if we want to grasp the essence of modern science, we must first free ourselves from the habit of comparing the new science with the old solely in terms of degree, right? From the point of view of progress. And I think this is very important and a very different way of thinking. Beryl, you wanted to say something? I saw your screen come on. Oh, okay. Yeah, but this is a very interesting way of approaching a subject matter. Again, this is not an enlightenment progress. All of a sudden came the second law of thermodynamics. All of a sudden came the light bulb, right? The telephone, etc. He's trying to do something radically different here. And if we follow him. So this is a very different moment in Heidegger. So the essence of what we call today science is research. And this is what Josh communicated to me that struck him, in terms of this reading, is Heidegger's notion of research. And we're all engaged in that in some way. Some of us through grants, some of us in our work and daily life, the way we cover the net, etc. So anyway, he's going to now take on this notion of reflection, science, right? Science not as progress, and moving forward in the fact that knowing, and in a way, establishes itself in a procedure within some realm of what is in nature and or in history. Procedure does not mean we have merely method or methodology. For every procedure already requires an open sphere. And this could give us a lot of insight of how the pandemic era, and by the way, Kristen is still here and Josh is here. We wrote a piece called Revolution in the Virocene, which is the lead piece in situations, in which we, did it in Benjaminian aphoristic style, citational style, but I think it's pretty good. An open sphere in which it moves. And it's precisely the opening up of such a sphere that is the fundamental event in research. How do we open up that sphere. This is accomplished through the projection within some realm of what is, in nature, for example, of a fixed ground plan of natural events. This projection sketches out in advance the manner in which the knowing procedure must bind itself and adhere to the sphere that is opened up. This binding adherence to the rigor of research, right, is the rigor of research. Through the projecting of the ground plan and the prescribing of rigor, procedure makes secure for itself the sphere of objects within the realm of being. A look at the earliest science, which is at the same time the normative one in the modern age, namely mathematical physics, will make clear, and we could substitute molecular biology if you'd like for our time, to think this through in terms of the biopolitical and Esposito and others that some people have read, will make clear what we mean. Inasmuch as modern atomic physics still remains physics, what is essential, and only this essential is named at here, the essential is named, will hold for it also. Modern physics is called mathematical because in a remarkable way, it makes use of a quite specific mathematics. But it can proceed mathematically in this way only because, in a deeper sense, it is already itself mathematical. The always, already, the presuppositions. Ta mathemata means for the Greeks that which man knows in advance in his observation of whatever is and in his intercourse with things. And I'm reminded here, for those of you who know the Platonic dialogue, Meno, the slave boy example, right? And the whole theory of recollection, the a priori knowledge that we do have, right? In a way that Socrates tries to exact, if you will, elicit from the slave boy in the dialogue. Okay, the corporality of bodies, the vegetable character of plants, the animality of animals, the humanness of man. Alongside these, belonging also to that which is already known, i.e. to the mathematical, are numbers. At the base of mathematics is arithmos, the arithmetic, the number, right? Arithmos. Right? If we come upon 3 apples on the table, we recognize there are only 3 of them, but the number threeness, we already know. So he's going through this Kantian, moment of those of you who have read the critique of, pure reason. How do I know 7 plus 5 equals 12, right? What is this a priori knowledge I have? So this is an attempt to go through the a priori again. How do we process? What do we already always know, etc.? What is that background? Only because numbers represented what? The most striking of always already knowns, and then offer the most familiar instance of the mathematical, is mathematical, properly reserved as a name for the numerical. In no way, however, is this the essence of the mathematical defined by numberness. Physics is in general the knowledge of nature, and in particular the knowledge of material corporality in its motion. For that corporality manifests itself immediately and universally in everything natural, even in a variety of ways. If physics takes shape explicitly, then as something mathematical, this means that in an especially pronounced way, through it and for it, something is stipulated in advance as what is already known. That stipulating has to do with nothing less than the plan or projection of that which must henceforth, for the knowing of nature that is sought after, be nature, the self-contained system of motion of units of mass related spatio-temporally into this ground plan of nature, as supplied in keeping with its prior stipulation, the following definitions, among others, that have been incorporated. Motion means change of place. And I just want to listen to that. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this in various ways. He's actually recapturing here book 4 of Aristotle's Physics. He's trying to go back to that as a primary text that's being layered onto the study, even though Aristotle is shunned, of course, by Galilean science, right? By modern science, the Copernican turn, if you will, in a sense. He's really trying to go back this to the always already known, right? Etc. So no motion or direction of motion is superior to any other. Every place is equal to each other. No point in time has preference over any other. Every force is defined accordingly, i.e. is only its consequences in motion, and that means in magnitude or change of place, in the unity of time. Every event must be seen as to fit in this ground plan of nature. Only within the perspective of this ground plan does an event in nature become visible as such an event. This projected plan of nature finds its guarantee in the fact that physical research in every one of its questioning steps is bound in advance to adhere to it. This binding adherence, the rigor of research, has its own character at any given time in keeping with the projected plan. The rigor of mathematical physics science is exactitude. Very important thing, because he's saying the Greeks did not need exactitude. So mathematical physical science. Here, all events, if they're to enter at all into representation of events of nature, must be defined beforehand as spatio-temporal magnitudes of motion. And such defining is accomplished through measuring with the help of number and calculation. But mathematical research into nature is not exact because it calculates with precision. Rather, it is because it must calculate in this way because its adherence to its object sphere has the character of exactitude. So this is interesting, this inversion. You don't just bring the ruler, it's demanded of the object, the measure, right? In many ways. Very, very interesting the way he turns this up. The humanistic sciences, in contrast, indeed all the sciences concerned with life, right, must necessarily be inexact just in order to remain rigorous. A living thing can indeed also be grasped as a spatio-temporal magnitude of motion, but then it is no longer apprehended as living. The inexactitude of the historical humanistic sciences is not a deficiency, but is only the fulfillment of a demand essential to this kind of research. It is true also that the projecting and securing of the object sphere, right, of the historical sciences is not only of another kind, but is much more difficult of execution than is also the achieving of rigor in the exact sciences. Science becomes, and I'll go to your second, Carl. I see. Yeah, science becomes research through the projected plan and through the securing of that plan in the rigor of procedure. Procedure and rigor, however, first develop into what they are in methodology. So go ahead, Carl. Yeah.
Oh, I just had a question. I mean, I'm totally new to this, but it seems like, how does he understand? It's almost like there's this conception of the world, and then mathematics becomes the science or the approach that's demanded of that conception. But I don't. How do you get to the conception without mathematics? Or like you said, the example you use is that the conception requires you to bring a ruler, but the notion of exact time, exact measure, how would you have that idea unless you had a ruler? So it gets kind of into chicken and the egg, I guess. But
yeah. I mean,
I don't. It's just interesting.
This is the question we can hold, for technics, right? In as we go forward, because in a way, the hand is shaped by the object, not the hand shaping the object later. This is one of the insights, in a sense. This is one of the insights of Leroy-Gourhan in gesture and speech, and of course Simondon too, in many ways, right? We are shaped by the object itself, the Epimethean thought in a way, rather than the Promethean, we're going to take the ruler out, measure, and then dominate. He is critiquing this Promethean view of nature as well too. Yeah. Okay. So Josh puts himself. And go ahead, Josh. You want to say? I mean, yeah. I'll try to read the chart. Yeah.
No. People are interested in like going a little deeper on this idea.
Yeah.
He's presenting here. Like he kind of goes a little more in depth into what these differences are, and I thought it was very interesting to read the history, and that's all. So I just thought people might be.
I mean, from pages in at least in the Lovett translation, 120, right, all the way. I mean, from where I'm reading, right, all the way up to objectification and the freeing of oneself, and the two notions, the Greek notions of subjectium, the hyperchemion, at the basis, what happens, how the subject, the underlying substance, becomes the subject in a certain way. This is all very interesting. So 120 through 28 kind of sets us up for picture thinking and world image, right? So Josh is right. The depth is here. We haven't really read it yet. Yeah, the depth is really here in terms of explaining what he's doing here, which you referred to the chicken and egg phenomena here in a way. But I do want to mention that Stiegler's notion of the technics itself is a way of that we are shaped by the object, right? We are not shaped by our use of the object, etc. We are shaped by that object in the hand. The hand is more shaped by the tool than we're using or employing the tool. That is one of their insights, right? And you'll see this in memory and rhythms and gesture and speech in Leroy Brougham. And we'll talk about this more as we get to Stiegler. What is technics versus that of the technological and Heidegger's notion of science, right? So so he'll do a lot of work. He'll talk about Roger Bacon, the modern research project, because what he's taking on here, if I can maybe preface this a little bit, and I don't want to keep you here forever. I can if you want, but it's not 20 after 9. But anyway, what he's really taking on here is modern research programs, right? That somehow they're not asking the question properly. They're not really asking the question. And again, as I mentioned, the proposition, science does not think. I'm not saying Heidegger's right. Please don't hear me this way. I want to follow, and I think to listen to his thought. And he's very clear about that. If we're going to read Heidegger, we should appreciate his notion. You want to look at the movement of the thought and engage that rather than bringing your own projections or your own, subjectivity to the reading, right? You want to follow it along the thought here. So he's really kind of opening up, how do we get to this time of the world picture? So he's giving us a background on this through science, and then particularly our modern science, mathematical physics, right? And how did we get to this, right? And is the Greek and the way of thinking with the Greeks a way that would allow us to maybe get out of it? Is it a liberating thing? And that's a question we can pose for Heidegger. Remember, this is 1938, right? We're on the verge of all kinds of stuff. Los Alamos, we're on the verge of all kinds of, advances in science. And of course, you can think this alongside the war machine, right? Completely. No problem for my mind to think it along the lines of the war machine. But anyway. So, anybody else? This just gives you a little bit of it. I would like us to read this for next week, and we'll take it up maybe for a week and a half, and then move on to the questioning. What is questioning for Heidegger? What does it mean to question technology? Yeah, this is another very important part. I don't know. Do you see this about science and research? It's really the stake here. And the science only reflects, right, in a sense, does not really think. And Heidegger is about ultimately the end of philosophy, as if I could use this again, the end of philosophy, that Western metaphysics has come to its closure, and unless you see this, right, you're going to miss a lot of what Heidegger's doing, that the Western metaphysical tradition from Plato to Nietzsche leads to nihilism, right? And that we need a new opening. I'm not sure Nietzsche would be included in this, but certainly Plato to Hegel, maybe. But anyway, this leads to a kind of nihilism, and we have to do a different path, a different orientation to rethink where we are and to reorient our thinking. So I think that he and Stiegler have this in common. They're thinking this together in many ways. So this is again, the meta narrative. I hate this. Now everybody's going to be using meta, around, with no understanding of what it is, thanks to this robot Zuckerberg. And anyway, yeah, the meta narrative is really about this history of Western metaphysics and the philosophy of Western metaphysics coming to its culmination, right? And then we have the end of metaphysics and the end of philosophy as such, and the beginning of the tasks of thinking. So you can read this as maybe the beginning of Heidegger's, turn towards thinking from philosophical investigation, if you will. Yeah, beginning to think through something very different. However, this goes back, and I think it was the third or fourth lecture I did on being in time, and certainly, read the text. People have done this better than me. The question concerning of new fundamental ontology, and he goes through this again. When Foucault comes up with the three disciplines of our time: labor, life, and language, right? Linguistics, political economy, and biology, and maybe molecular biology. He's riffing off of Heidegger. Heidegger would not like that, but this is what Foucault's doing, and Foucault in some ways is a kind of new positivism. It's a new positivism that's taking place. But we can talk about that for those of you that like Michel Foucault. Carl, I know you're not crazy about him, but anyway, no. we can actually talk about where he is philosophically in all of this too. And yeah.
I'd be interested in you or other people just talking about what you said about how Heidegger sees this tradition leading to nihilism, just, as a little bit of background. So at some point, when we're talking about Heidegger.
Yeah, well, the will to will, and the will to power ultimately leads to nihilism. And Nietzsche becomes the culmination of the Western metaphysical tradition. That it really is this will to power. And the will, nihilism in a way, is the will to do nothing too, vis-a-vis that power. So he sees this unfolding in the history of one of the reasons environmentalists have taken to Heidegger in some ways, the echo things. Yeah. So anyway, okay. So one person had another class. I guess they're in a time zone where the class is going on. So anyway, yeah, we can talk about this, but this is part of the history of being for him. Self-consciousness, which culminates again from the cogito, or really even Lutheran subjectivity, all the way to where we are, to this new time of the world picture, is a very long tradition, and it leads ultimately to this, subjectivism that is a will to dominate, and that this ultimately will lead to if you will, a new nihilism, etc. Now, Nietzsche is very different, and we can talk about this, but I'm trying to stick with Heidegger here, Nietzsche's notion of nihilism. But he does. He hints at this, and look at what he does with Christianity, right? What I was reading here. This is an important section. He says, again, this is on page 160, the loss of the gods. On the one hand, the world picture. This worldview we have. We like to talk about worldviews. He's talking about picture, Bildung, whereas before it was world perception, right, etc. Yeah, thank you, Gretchen. We're glad to see you. We hope to see you next week. The loss of the gods. This expression does not mean that me gearing away with the gods, or what he calls gross atheism, right? The loss of the gods is a twofold process, right? On the one hand, the world picture is Christianized, right? The Christianized world picture, right? Yeah. As the cause of the world is positive and infinite, right? The infinite time, etc. Eternitas, outside of time, eternity, unconditional, right? Everybody can be forgiven, just believe, etc. And absolute, the absolute itself, right? On the other hand, Christendom, not Christianized worldview, is the world picture. Christendom as a movement transforms Christian doctrine into a worldview, the Christian worldview, and in that way makes itself modern and up to date, right? The loss of the gods is the situation of indecision regarding God and the gods. Christendom has the greatest share in bringing this about. But the loss of the gods is so far from excluding religiosity, then rather only through that loss is the relation to the gods changed into mere religious experience, right? Okay, so when this occurs, then the gods have fled, right? This resultant void is compensated for by means of historiographical and psychological investigation of myth. Look, again, I mean, this mind, if you will, this thinker from the Black Forest, is around people that are doing work on this. Rudolf Otto on the idea of the holy, Bultmann, all these negative theologians are doing work on this. Myth is put out there in terms of religious experience again. As most of you know, William James, the varieties of religious experience. This is somewhat in the air still, right? In many ways. So he's really trying to understand this. Again, if we go back to this distinction he's making between Erfahrung, as profound experience from which we learn and we discover, versus that of aliveness, experience on the surface, right? And he goes through many levels of this throughout these layers of experience throughout this. So in a way, he understands this in a sense, right? That the Erfahrung is to understand the Christianized notion of the world view, the world picture itself. What does it give us? Infinite, fulfillment, if you will, in the eternal, right? The absolute, the unconditional, etc. Right? Yeah. So this is another aspect. So I think we should, stay with this as much as his thinking allows. I don't think these are going to become chicken or egg phenomena. They're really about, discovery and learning on the one hand, a more profound experience in reading and learning. So, and then this relationship of modern science and research. We're all in this pandemic, all we get is new statistical approaches every day. Pfizer's new booster, 92% effective in this age group, et cetera. We're not getting any kind of real transformation that's going on in many ways. Everything is its drive, if you will, towards the new normal, towards, let's get back in person, et cetera, et cetera. What does this really mean? So in a way, Heidegger's very right about research programs, where they go, in a sense. Are they really transformative? Are they really changing for the better? And we can think this through, both through political economy, but also philosophically. How is this posited? How is this being done? And what metaphysical era are we living in a sense, right? We think we can dominate all this. There are no things. Look at these idiots in the climate change summit. I mean, literally idiots. The U.S. wants to go back on previous, standards and measures, right? Just look at this, what's happening in the world today, And we got Mr. Clown calling an autistic young girl, she should be in anger management. This is the level of thinking we have from, people in power. And believe me, in a sense, if we don't do something, I promise you, 2024 may be the return of something we don't want, right? And 2022 is looking that way in the United States. A lot of us here live in New York City, and we said nothing's going to happen, or San Francisco or other points, but where our friend came from Arizona may be a very different story. The people we have from Texas is going to be a very different story. So we have to really think about this too, how that's framed in a way. But again, I want to stay with this, if you will, this paradigm of how research is done. What is this research done? And how he's trying to get away from that by beginning this dialogue, if you will, is what is ta mathemata? Doing your lesson in Greek and being transformed in, you do your lesson. Mathemata means to do your lesson. The word mathematics comes from doing your lesson in the ancient Greek. It's a very interesting, strong thing. Yeah. So anyway, okay. Thank you, Patrick. Okay. I guess, yeah, some people are getting tired. So yeah. Anyway, any questions or remarks or suggestions? I would like us to read this next week. I'll be in New York, so I'm in place in Montreal right now, but I'll be in New York next week, so it'll be from my hovel there. And anyway, I'll pick it up where we left off. But please feel free, to make comments along the way. So we'll go back to this notion of science, go forward, and then what is the world picture? And what the whole section is really about a long critique of scientism and really science in a sense, right? It's a long critique in a good way. I mean, in a positive way. It could strengthen scientific inquiry, in my opinion. Yeah, in many ways, right? So, yeah, I mean, he's really a thinker against technoscience. Yeah, in many ways. He's a major thinker against that. He has positioned himself there. Yeah, and they're very good things here. Richard has left us, but they're very good quotes from the Greeks later on, from Pythagoras to Socrates, etc. So a very dense section, the age of the worldview, and of course, please, completely against Cartesian logic, but I'm going to talk more about that. That's a good point, Phil. Yeah. So, and so I'll speak more to this next week, and please feel free if you have the time. I don't know what your time restraints are, but the section on science and reflection, he takes up the last chapter of this book. We're not reading this, but we certainly can, or look at it. And then, of course, the question concerning technology. And one of the major aspects of this whole notion of nihilism is in God is Dead, his meditation on Nietzsche, which is the meditation on the word. Nietzsche, Thought ist tot, right? In German, Thought ist tot. God is dead, right? Nietzsche's pronouncement, right? In a sense, of which Heidegger, maybe and maybe not, didn't ever get over. But anyway, we can speak to that as well. So anyway, it's good to see everybody. I don't want to, again, I hope this was a good opening. I can go back and we'll pick it up next week. And I thank everybody for their little both suggestions, questions, and thoughts. And yeah, David, thanks for bringing up Winter's bringing up the Kittler being taught in Rutgers and all that. Good to see you. Yeah, and yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, everybody. And Matt says he's going to send out the readings. So, and yeah. And I hope, Jeff, this is we're not going to attack Boeing too much. I promise. Yeah.
Believe me, that will not be a problem.
Okay, good.
I would be glad to do that myself.
Bravo. Okay, bravo. Okay. Great. Okay. So thank you. And Beryl, you guys are out of quarantine now, so to speak?
Yeah, just 5 days
okay.
We've been out.
Cool.
But this just means we're living with the virus.
You're living with
we've
the virus.
Got thousands of cases.
Okay. Revolution in the virus scene.
Exactly.
I'll have it sent out to everybody.
Yeah, it's a good piece.
On the Institute chain thing. But the issue looks good. It's got nice regal colors of the aristocratic purple. the new journal. Yeah. So
excellent.
Anyway, it has the piece in it. And it's actually a reflection on Walter Benjamin's state of exception, the whole piece. Yeah. Anyway, long. Okay, so good to see everybody. See everybody next week from the Big Apple. Yeah, okay. Yeah.